Hi, and welcome to the Intro to Azure Monitor Series. This is Part 1, Foundation. My name is Russ Maxwell, and the date of this recording is September 15th, 2020. And so I plan on doing a series covering various aspects of Azure Monitor, and I will try to make them as demo-heavy as possible. And let's begin. In this first session, I'm going to cover the foundational elements of Azure Monitor. And to me, those are platform logs, the Log Analytics Workspace, and resource log enablement. My goal in this video series is to put my stamp on what Azure Monitoring means to me. Most of this is already documented, but I do prefer to take the nuts and bolts out of what I consider lengthy content and give you the basics that you can build upon. Moving on, one might ask, what are the ingredients that comprise of an Azure monitoring solution? So really that's up to the requirements of the solution. So for example, if I need to monitor a third-party web application outside of Azure, I can do that. You have several ingredients here that make this Azure Monitor meal. So these are the main ingredients I think about when coming up with an Azure monitoring solution. I will cover at this basic level logs and metrics, the Log Analytics Workspace, and one of the sources. Let's move on. So these are the tools available. We'll start with the Azure portal. That's your UI into Azure Monitoring. You also have the option to use Azure CLI and PowerShell with the Azure module. And you can run those either locally on your desktop, or you can also run those within Azure Cloud Shell. And Azure Cloud Shell is available directly within the Azure portal. And finally, you have the REST API, which is a great avenue for developers to send telemetry data to Azure Monitor from their custom solution. The platform logs, this is a base type of log within the Azure platform. And so they provide logging and auditing details for both Azure resources and the Azure platform itself. The platform logs, they are automatically generated and can be forwarded to destinations for data retention purposes. So Microsoft has 3 types of platform logs. Let's start with activity log. So activity log, there's only one activity log per Azure subscription. It's free. It's always on and always available out of the box. They give you high-level events like when a resource is updated or changed. So for example, if I stop and deallocate a virtual machine, that's going to be logged in activity log. So there's some different areas where you can view activity logs in the Azure portal. To see all of the events, you would go to Azure Monitor and select activity log. Within the activity logs, you have 3 different sources that log to it. Let's start with the first one, and that's basically the change request events. So these are output events for Azure resources in the subscription from outside the management plane. So these are change requests that are made by Azure Resource Manager given to a specified Azure resource. So that's exactly what that stop and start example I gave you earlier with the VM, that's going to be considered a change request event. The second type of source within activity log are service health events. And these are high-level events that identify the what, who, and when something occurred against a resource. So for example, if Azure determines there's an outage for a blob storage account in the US Central region, they would likely publish an outage record to those impacted Azure subscriptions. That outage record is recognized as a service health event. The third type of activity log event or source are resource health events. And they do exactly what the title indicates. They help you identify if a resource is healthy or not healthy. We also have resource logs. So it's another type of platform log. And these were previously known as diagnostic logs. So they include events performed within an Azure resource within the data plane. So these are obviously going to be more detailed logs, and each Azure resource type will log unique entry types. So one really important thing I want to state is that resource logs, you can't view them for a given Azure resource until you enable diagnostic logging and send them somewhere. So Microsoft refers to this as the opt-in model. I'll talk a little more about this later. Finally, you have Azure Active Directory logs, and these work at the Azure tenant level and provide details for things like user sign-in. Next, we have metrics. So just like platform logs, we have metrics. And just like activity logs, for example, Azure will monitor metrics as soon as you spin up a subscription. So they are generated by default. They are numeric values, and they are logged at a certain time interval on one or more Azure resources. I'm looking at Metric Explorer within the Azure portal within Azure Monitor. And specifically, you can see it's the host VM status for CPU utilization. So finally, one more thing I'd like to mention is that both of these metrics and platform logs, by default, there's no Log Analytics Workspace required. So I can actually view these, work with them without a Log Analytics Workspace. We'll talk about why you really want a Log Analytics Workspace in a moment. Let's go ahead and jump into a demo with activity logs and metrics. Okay, I'm in Azure Monitor via the Azure portal, and within here I'm going to actually click on activity log. Show you what that looks like. Okay, so you can see I've got its last span time of 6 hours. So let's say I want to look at the past 24 hours, I can do so. And again, this is a type of platform log. So it does have a 90-day retention. If I need more than that, I should consider sending these off to a Log Analytics Workspace. But these are the high-level events, like signaling when a virtual machine is stopped or started, or when an Azure resource is deleted. So Azure Portal does have some nice built-in options for doing filtering or adding additional columns from this interface. And next up we have metrics. And so when I click on metrics, the first thing I'm prompted with is to select a scope. And I'm interested in actually looking at that virtual machine and seeing what the metrics look like. So I'm going to select that particular virtual machine and hit apply. And again, this is at the host level. So I'm going to look at, I'm interested in the CPU. So very little. There's not a whole lot going on here. So you can see the dotted line. And I can add additional metrics to this if I would like. Let's do CPU credits remaining. Got nothing there. There we go. I got 6552 credits remaining. So again, these are, once in a real production environment, you're going to see more details around this. But what's nice about this is I can actually go in and create an alert rule off of these metrics if there's something specific I'm interested in looking at. What I will mention is when you create alert rules, if I create an alert, which is basically a way to be notified, for example, I can create an alert rule that if CPU utilization gets above 95% for a certain period of time, I can set up an alert that'll shoot me an email and let me know. Common question is, can I create an alert that includes both conditions that are metrics and activity logs? No, you cannot mix those. So you can have an alert that has plenty of more than one metric condition, or you can create an alert that has only one activity log condition. So I'll show you a list of videos I'm doing in the series, and alerting is one of them, so I'm not going to do it here. I stopped and let this run for a little while. Notice how I have a dotted line for both CPU average as well as CPU credits remaining, and then it goes solid towards the end. The dotted line at Azure Metrics Explorer, that indicates there's no measured value between the time interval. So each dot represents a sample period. So between that period, there was null. It wasn't able to collect anything. The solid line actually is when it starts collecting data. Next up, we have the Log Analytics Workspace, and it is a critical component of your Azure Monitor solution. And it's basically a large container that contains a bunch of tables. So if you need to store diagnostic data in your Azure resources, custom applications, if you need to store the activity log, the Log Analytics Workspace, that is the place to store that data. And so it is an Azure resource like any other that you provision, and you provision using Azure Portal, Azure CLI, or PowerShell. By default, when you create a Log Analytics Workspace, you automatically get a metrics and logs data stores. And what's great about the Log Analytics Workspace is not only is the data stored in these tables, but you can do some nice things with that data. So for example, I can set up an alert based off what's the data in these tables. I can also create dashboards. There's also Power BI integration. So there's a lot you can do. You can even explore the data directly. And you can use the KQL to do that. So that's the Kusto query language. And it reminds me a little bit of SQL with some elements of PowerShell like pipelining. And I'll show you that in a bit. Okay, next up we need to talk about resource logs. So it's important to visualize or think about the source of each logging type. In the case of resource logs, the source are the Azure resources themselves. So remember, Azure resource logs, they are generated, but you can't see them because they're not stored anywhere by default. So in order to review and do things with those resource logs, you need to create a diagnostic setting for that particular Azure resource. And so this is basically saying I want to send log or metric or log and metric data somewhere. And so that somewhere could be 3 different places. So you do have the option to send to a Log Analytics Workspace, which is the most popular option. You can also archive that data to a storage account or stream to an event hub. And so in this demo, we're going to work with the Log Analytics Workspace and go through resource log enablement. Okay, so I'm in my Azure subscription, and the first thing I want to show you is that I don't have a Log Analytics Workspace set up. So if I click Log Analytics Workspaces, you can see there's nothing there. And one other indicator is to go into Azure Monitor. And if I click on logs, the logs actually ties directly in with Log Analytics Workspace. And you can see that I get a spinning circle and it just kind of sits there. So this is another indicator that I do not have a Log Analytics Workspace set up. Let's move on from there. Let's create our first Log Analytics Workspace. So in order to do that, I'll just click Log Analytics Workspace and click Add here. And I'm going to drop this in a resource group I've already provisioned. Okay, that looks good. Go to Review and Create. Great, it did complete. So let's go take a look at the resource. I'll go ahead and select Go to Resource. And I'm in my Log Analytics workspace. So this is my view of the Log Analytics workspace. I'm interested in just showing some of the out-of-the-box tables when you create the Log Analytics workspace. So I have a couple different ways to get there. The first way is clicking on View Logs from this particular window. So I can click Search and Analyze Logs. I'm not going to do that. I'd rather use Azure Monitor and access it that way. So let's do that. So I'm just going to select Azure Monitor. And if I click Logs here, this is the same view I'm going to get. And notice when I click Logs, I have a bunch of queries available. So Microsoft has written a bunch of KQL queries to automate a particular task. They're categorized here on the left. So for example, if I want to work with the Azure Cosmos DB, I can select it, and I'm going to receive some what Microsoft considers queries that you would probably run more than once. So things like show the slowest queries and identify the top 5 slowest ones. So what's nice about that is if I click Run, it's going to show up in this editor, and I can actually make changes to it. So if I want to enhance the original query, I can add my own logic to it. I can change it. So it's very flexible. So on the left, notice there's 3 different tabs. There's Filter, Queries, and Tables. I'm under Queries, so I'm going to select Tables here and just show you some of the out-of-the-box tables available. And these are created when I create a Log Analytics workspace. If I expand these tables, underneath these are all the columns associated with the table. And next to the columns, appended are the type of column. So I've got a bunch of string columns here. I've got an int column. And so it's nicely organized, and let's move on. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the Azure Monitor Overview page. And remember, after you create a Log Analytics workspace, you actually have to send data to it. And that's why I discussed the platform logs earlier, because those, in this session, that's exactly what I'm going to do, is I'm going to push the activity log details. I'm going to push that into this new Log Analytics workspace, as well as enable resource logs on an Azure resource. So let's start with the activity log. So from Azure Monitor, I'm going to click Activity Log. And notice I have this diagnostic setting available. I'm going to go ahead and click on it. And I'm going to create a new diagnostic setting. I'll just call it Russ Max Activity. That's going to be the name of my diagnostic setting. I want all the events. So the resource health, service health, as well as the other logging sources. I want them all. And as far as destination, I do want to send to a Log Analytics workspace, and it defaults to the only Log Analytics workspace I have provisioned. So that's perfect. And let's click Save. Back into the Azure Monitor Overview page, I waited about 30 minutes after creating that diagnostic setting, and within that 30 minutes, I created a virtual machine, and I deallocated that virtual machine a few times. So I stopped and started the virtual machine. And really, the idea behind that was to go ahead and populate entries into the activity log, which would also get written out to the Log Analytics workspace. Let's take a look. So I'm going to click Logs. And notice under Log Management, I've got a few new tables as a result of enabling that diagnostic setting for Activity Log. I have Azure Activity, Azure Diagnostics, Azure Metrics, Event, Heartbeat, Perf, Syslog, and W3C log. Now, I'm not interested in every table at this moment. I'm only interested in the table that was written to as a result of creating the virtual machine and making some changes to it. And that table is the Azure Activity table. So one of the most common ways to know if your table is populated with data, which would indicate that things were running successfully after enabling that diagnostic setting, would be to run a simple query where you get a count of all the rows in that table. So I'm going to type in that table name. I'm going to use the pipe symbol I mentioned, and I'm going to pipe the entire table over to count function, and that's going to give me the count of the rows. Notice I have 100 rows, so this was successful. I do have data in there, and that's great news. To view all of the rows within the table, really easy to do. I can just type in the table name, highlight it, and select Run. And that gives me all of the entries that were basically written to the Log Analytics Workspace as a result of creating that diagnostic setting with an activity log. So the first scenario that I'd like to show you is an example of where I deployed that virtual machine, and notice since I switched the page, I have that correlation ID, and really the correlation ID is linked to all the events that were part of this VM creation. And so this is something that I've seen previously in my SharePoint days, where correlation ID will get stamped with the same ID as part of a transaction of something. So in this case, the transaction was creating a virtual machine. And in my scenario, in this test scenario, let's assume that I had a problem with this deployment, and I wanted to dig in and understand where things went awry. And that's where this correlation ID can help you with querying the Log Analytics Workspace. So the first thing I'm going to do is copy that correlation ID. I'm going to go back into Azure Monitor. So where correlation ID, and I'll drop the correlation ID in. So notice it does have, does look a little bit like SQL. And I'm going to have another session where I cover a good intro into KQL so you feel comfortable with what's being typed here. I'm going to go ahead and highlight this and select Run. And what's nice is this shows me all the events associated with that deployment. So if I wanted to dig in and understand where things may have been unsuccessful or errored, I can do that. In my case, it was successful, so let's move on. So let's assume that you're not comfortable with KQL yet, and you're looking for something specific. And remember, the second thing I did was I started and stopped that virtual machine a few times, so I deallocated it. And I can actually find those events without running any queries other than specifying the table name. And so that's what I'm going to do. And what I can use is this bottom window pane here that has some nice built-in filtering I can do. I can click the filter contains and deallocating, and hit filter again. And these are the two events. So again, this is a very small Azure deployment. And so I only have a couple events here. So I may need to filter it further, but you get the idea, right? So you don't necessarily have to be an expert in KQL. You can simply use the built-in filtering options below. Okay, we covered moving activity logs and setting that up with the diagnostic setting to move those entries into a log analytics workspace. What about resource logs, which is another type of platform log? And that's tied in with the Azure resources themselves. So let's grab an Azure resource and enable that. I'm going to select the network security group. And it's a rinse and repeat of the same process I used in activity log. So I go to diagnostic settings, I select add diagnostic setting. Check what I'd like to log, and I'm going to send it to the same log analytics workspace. One question I've seen around is, can I send certain Azure resources? Can I send diagnostic data, those resource logs, to a different log analytics workspace? You can. It's not recommended. I'll go ahead and save this. Okay, it's updated. Last thing I want to show you is at the resource group level that contains this network security group. What's nice about the resource group level is if I go into diagnostic settings, I get a high-level overview of all the resources that reside in that resource group and whether or not the diagnostic settings are enabled for that given resource. So here you can see I've got the network security group enabled. Okay, you've made it through part 1 of the Azure Monitor Series Foundation. The next video or session coming up is log access and design considerations, and we will go through the list you see there. And feel free to subscribe to my channel, as I will be covering various Azure components in the near future. Thank you again.